Hello everyone, this is a video about William Blake's poem The Schoolboy, which comes from his collection which was published in 1794, Songs of Innocence and of Experience. This is aimed at students studying Blake for their A-level in English literature, and there are many specifications which Blake forms a part. This is designed to be a short video giving you key concepts. So to give you a summary of the poem, it's a relatively simple poem, although there are some more ambiguous metaphors towards the end. In this poem, a young boy who is our speaker wakes up to find a joyful depiction of summer and nature outside his bedroom window. But because it is a school day, he goes to school, or is forced to go to school, and the joyous depiction of nature, which is synonymous with freedom, is replaced with the oppression and repressive nature of the boy's classroom, where learning takes place. And there is also mention of the cruel eye of the teacher or head teacher, which is synonymous with authority. This is not just a poem about a boy going to school. As is usually the case with Blake, there is a degree of attack towards something in this poem, of which the child is being used as the vehicle by which that attack can be conveyed. And here, despite Blake of course being literate and a published poet, Blake is attacking the education system as an institution that is responsible for taking away a child's sense of freedom, which they might get from play and learning and being outside, with a more regimented approach to education sat behind desks in classrooms. The second paragraph here I have taken from AQA's text overview, which is available online, in which it goes into a little bit more detail about some of the quotes. But again, we can see here at the bottom there that Blake is suggesting that when children are taken away from the natural rhythms of life, conveyed in the poem through the presentation of nature, they will be cast into a world of winter barrenness. So the full text overview for the collection of poems is available online. As is the case with when I teach my students, I often get them to discuss about English, the way English is taught in schools. Of course, we have set texts. There is really a lack of flexibility sometimes in what your teacher can teach you, because teachers are given a list of so many texts. So a criticism, of course, of the education system, particularly with the humanities, is that we have set texts, set exams, a set curriculum, and a lack of flexibility in what students can learn and what teachers can teach. I always think, for example, out of the thousands of texts that have been published over the centuries, I teach my A-level students 7 of them, and you think that isn't really very flexible. So you have, of course, experience as well, if you've got to A-level, of 12 or 13 years in education, and just try and think about how many exams you've sat in that time, or how many hours you have sat behind a desk. So here is the poem. It's one of Blake's longer poems, and it features in the collection Songs of Innocence, which was published 5 years before the Experience collection, and then in 1794 both collections were put together to form one edition, and they've been together ever since. I also believe that this poem was originally put in the Songs of Experience, and then it was moved into Innocence after 1794, because unlike other poems such as Laughing Song or The Echoing Green, this does have a more ominous depiction of child suffering and suppression, which is of course more synonymous with a poem which might feature in the Experience collection. So if we look at the first stanza, we begin with the first person singular pronoun I, suggesting that we have a homodiegetic perspective. The speaker, therefore, is a child and talking about their own experiences. The child says that he loves to rise in the summer morn, and the summer has connotations of warmth and contentment. And this first stanza is very utopian in its depiction of the child's relationship with the green world, or the pastoral outside his bedroom window. It's morning before school, and the connotation of that, of course, is a sense of renewal and optimism as a new day begins. There is reference to birds, and birds are a common motif in Blake. Here they are singing in every tree, so there is an unlimited sense of jubilation and joy. And the huntsman and the skylarks also create this real sense of collective enjoyment and joy. And the stanza finishes with the phrase, "What sweet company." And this suggests that nature is in a state of equilibrium with the child, and when that happens, there is the greatest sense of joy and freedom, because there is a sense of harmony there. And it's very typical of Blake as a romantic poet, of course, to have some synonymous relationship between youth and nature as being quite valid and being something that's very positive and utopian. However, that sense of optimism does not last very long, and grammatically you could say that that is represented by the fronted conjunction but. It's fronted because it's at the beginning of the line, and that suggests a change in mood, and we go from a utopian sense of joy and depiction of the child's life to a more dystopian one as it's time to go to school. And as the child admits, going to school drives all joy away. So the education system here, what Blake is suggesting, is responsible for the eradication of joy as seen in stanza 1. When the child gets to school, there is the cruel eye of the teacher or the principal or head teacher, which is synonymous with the idea of supervision, authority, and even surveillance. And this is representative as well of oppression and suppression of freedom. The preposition under suggests that there is a power hierarchy here. The children are less powerful than the teacher or teachers, and in some respects they are like prisoners in this school. The adjective little suggests that the children are helpless and vulnerable, and because they spend the whole day in this situation, it's very restrictive and also very regimented, as you will know because you've been very used over your school career with having timetables and times when you're supposed to be places. You also have the words sighing and dismay there, which juxtaposes with the joyous language of the first stanza and the freedom that was presented by an equilibrium with the pastoral or nature. As we move into stanza 3, we start to see imagery of the child's body language. He sits at his desk drooping, and obviously this suggests something that's wilting or that's lifeless. And we have here, I suppose, a metaphor linked to plants, which continues into the last two stanzas as well. The adjective anxious suggests that the speaker spends much of the day feeling miserable, and so miserable in fact that the child cannot take comfort from learning. He cannot take comfort from reading, and he cannot take comfort from the sanctuary of knowledge shown through that word bower. And the adjective dreary continues that sense of misery. So even though the child is gone to school to learn and to read, perhaps, the child is not enjoying reading or learning, perhaps because the child is not reading or learning what it wants to learn. It's being told what it should learn in the same way that you have been told what you should be learning because of the national curriculum. What Blake seems to be suggesting is if students got to choose their own books to study, then they would benefit more than being forced to study texts that the exam board, for example, chooses. And then as we go into the next stanza, we have the use of repetition of rhetorical questions. Typical motif, of course, of oppression and this idea of being suppressed is the idea of the bird in the cage, which suggests the erosion of freedom, and because of the forced and oppressive nature of the education system and learning. So it's a very restrictive existence, which again clashes with the opening sense of freedom from that first stanza. Birds, of course, have already been referred to in this poem. They were referred to in the first stanza, but in that stanza they were singing and they were flying around quite freely. Here, though, they are caged and they're not singing. And clearly that is a metaphor for the child in the classroom, as if the child is a caged bird. We also have the idea that children and people more generally, in Blake's view, are born to experience joy and pleasure and a degree of freedom. But what Blake is suggesting is that the education system is responsible for the erosion of that joy, replacing it with suffering and constraint. We've got the adjective tender, which suggests unhappiness, powerless, and vulnerability, as well as the inability to fly. So in other words, the child is trapped in the classroom in the same way that the bird is trapped in the cage. And the reference to spring there reinforces the loss of innocence, because spring, of course, is synonymous with renewal and regrowth. However, in this case, there's a sense that spring is being lost because of this regimented sense of schooling, which is at odds with the freedom offered by nature in the first stanza. The youthful spring is reinforced by the first stanza before the child was forced to go to school. Coming towards the end of the poem, in the penultimate stanza, the child turns to his parents, O father and mother, almost as a plea, maybe quite melodramatically, for help and freedom. However, as is the case in a number of Blake's poems in the collection as a whole, the depiction of a parental or adult figure is not always complimentary. And the question that has to be asked here is, despite the child's desperate pleas shown through the exclamatives there, do you think they'd listen? I think the answer is probably not, and that the father and mother would still force their child to go to school. We also have in these last two stanzas of the poem reference to frosts and the idea of the impact of what frosts have on young plants and buds, for example. So we have semantics of nature, which is a metaphor for representing the loss of innocence, this idea of buds being nipped. If school is responsible for blighting a child's innocence, for example, then it's no wonder that that has been chosen as a metaphor to reinforce that loss of freedom. So what Blake seems to be suggesting here is that the rearing of children is compared to the growing of a plant that needs love, care, and the particular type of conditions in order for it to grow properly. In other words, if children are not allowed to experience childhood in nature and that sense of freedom that nature offers, then they shall wither before they blossom into adults. So what Blake is saying is the education system is responsible for churning out a lot of children who have their sense of misery and oppression reinforced, rather than allowing them to go into adulthood with a sense of freedom and joy. We also have at the bottom there of that stanza the words sorrow and dismay. Dismay has already been used, of course, which is again at odds with the positive language of the first stanza. And finally, in the last stanza, again, we've got the continuation of the rhetorical questions. Reference to summer, again, a very different type of summer that's depicted, of course, in the first line of the poem, which was kind of to do with enjoyment and contentment. Here, summer is being used as a rhetorical device, really, for Blake to ask through the mouthpiece of the child, how will summer spring into bloom if the frosts have blighted the plants when they were young? If you have no buds, you're going to get no flowers in summer, for example. So, of course, this is another metaphor. How will children grow up happy if they are forced into an oppressive form of schooling? We have the anaphora as well of or at the beginning of 3 of those lines, which perhaps represents and emphasises the child's desperation to appeal to his parents to understand the plight that the education system is having to his schooling. Is Blake therefore suggesting that the parents are neglectful for sending their child to school? And finally, reference to winter. Again, common in Blake, use of coldness or winter in many of the poems in the collection as a metaphor for the ominous imposition of adulthood and experience. Is Blake suggesting, therefore, the education system prepares children for a life of misery because it's all they've ever known, because it takes away that sense of symbiotic equilibrium with nature as seen in the opening stanza? So that is a brief summary of the Schoolboy. Of course, there's lots more out there to do with perhaps a more detailed analysis of the poem, but hopefully that has been helpful in the analysis of this particular poem.